Welcome to the Nick Taylor Horror Show. Phil Nobile Jr. is a producer, director, and journalist who was recently appointed to one of the coolest jobs in the world, editor-in-chief of FANGORIA Magazine. As many of you know, FANGORIA was recently resurrected and is bigger, bloodier, and better than ever. Between his recent ascension to the FANGORIA publishing throne and executive producing Horror Noire, a black history of horror on Shudder, which I really loved. With all these things combined, Phil has had a hell of a year. I was lucky enough to be able to sit down with him here in New York and discuss all things FANGORIA, and we did a heavy amount of geeking out about horror along the way. I was really excited to talk to Phil. FANGORIA has been a highlight of my last year. Seeing it come back in such glory has really been fantastic, because FANGORIA was a magazine that I adored as a kid, and I would hide them in a stack next to a stack of Playboys. That's how that's essentially how much they were not allowed in my household, so to speak. But to see it crash and burn and then rise out of the ashes in such a fantastic way was really, really heartwarming for me in particular. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Phil. We talk about FANGORIA. We talk about how we brought it back. We talk about what is in future for FANGORIA. And we dive a little bit into what they're including in the FANGORIA 40th anniversary issue, which is coming out this July. If you have not subscribed, I don't know how you call yourself a horror fan. If you've not subscribed, I highly recommend you do so. Go to fangoria.com. The issues come out on a quarterly basis. They're beautiful. Trust me, they are not anything like magazines, and how you will not throw them away. These are volumes. These are, as they say, north of a magazine, south of a book. These things are formidable. They're beautiful, and they last a long time. They really feel like books, and they just have a timeless quality to them, and I'm a huge fan, obviously. Anyway, go get a subscription to FANGORIA, fangoria.com if you haven't already, and enjoy my conversation with the great Phil Nobile Jr. Phil Nobile, good to see you, man.
Good to see you.
How's everything going?
It's going.
Good,
It's going all right.
Good. What brings you here to New York today?
Today we're doing a release party for issue 3 of Forbidden Planet Comics. It's become a little bit of a tradition. We've had one for each issue so far.
Nice.
And it's been always a good time. Mm-hmm. And even though I caught a horrible cold from shaking 200 hands last time.
Oh, shoot.
But
Purell, man.
I got the Purell this time. I think we're going to be in good shape.
Smart. Yeah, I was at the last one. It's a lot of fun to just meet the writers, and then had the last podcast from the Left guys were there.
Yeah.
And the dudes who directed Pledge were there. So, I mean, overall, one thing I'm really curious about is, considering the position that you're in, what does your movie diet look like? How do you kind of stay on top of all the movies that are coming out and have a foot in the older movies and discover old gems?
I used to watch a lot more movies before I had the FANGO gig. I used to have time to watch more movies. But in terms of keeping on top of stuff, I have to do a fair amount of delegating now, right, because I don't get to go to every film festival. So somebody at Sundance will tell me what to look out for, or will be responsible for reporting on that film in the issue. Somebody at South by, and so on and so forth. I go to a couple of festivals, but just the way it shook out last year, the festivals that I went to were more to promote FANGORIA's films, right, than to ingest. So it's, and the other thing that happened with the FANGO gig is that people ask you to be on a jury, and so you're suddenly mainlining 14 movies in 4 days.
Whoa.
And that's no way to watch a movie. I don't like that. I think 3 is the max. Otherwise, you're not really doing a service to the films that you're watching.
Unless you're at home and there's wine involved, and you can kind of relax through them.
Yeah, I landed in Montreal for Fantasia and had to cram in like 14 movies in like 4 days, and it was rough.
Intense. Yeah.
And I barely remember them now. So,
well, that's a shame.
Not great. So what it's taught me to do is not take watching a movie for granted. It's kind of fun when I get to see stuff, and I used to go see everything, and now I've got to be a little more selective, and maybe I have to wait for HBO for Aquaman, and right. It is what it is.
You get your Avenger tickets though?
I did not.
Yeah, me neither.
No, I didn't understand the craze for it. I was like, are they only showing it one day?
Right.
Like I'll get there. And you know, I did kind of hose myself by coming to a signing in a comic store on the day the Avengers movie came out.
Oh, that's right.
So if I go upstairs and don't get spoiled, it's going to be a miracle. But I'm hoping. You know, that's what I'm hoping.
Cool. Have you seen anything lately that's particularly blown your mind in the realm of horror?
It's you know, we're in this weird is it horror, isn't horror space, and to me horror is an emotion. So that's my yardstick for whether or not something's horror. So there's a movie that I would call a horror film called The Perfection that's hitting Netflix in May.
Okay.
It is to tell you almost anything, or even to tell you what genres it's riffing on would spoil it, but it takes so many twists and turns. I saw 2 movies this year where I could say I didn't know what was going to happen next, and I couldn't wait to see what was going to happen next. That was one of them. And the other one is Under the Silver Lake, which is not horror at all.
Oh, yeah. I just added that to my to-watch list, which is getting increasingly longer.
I told you about Fantasia and about having to see 14 movies. Right. Nevertheless, I carved out 2.5 hours to go watch Under the Silver Lake at Fantasia. I put my foot down and said, I'm going to go see this. And I really loved it so much that I bought the French Amazon Blu-ray because it's already out on video over there.
You just couldn't wait.
Well, because they kept kicking the release date down the road. Uh-huh. And then I have this supernatural power of when I buy something on Blu-ray, it gets released. So within a week of buying it, they dropped it on VOD.
I hate when that happens.
Yeah. So, but The Perfection is, I would definitely call it a horror movie. It is, it's gory and it is riveting, and it is like practically a two-hander for most of the film. It's got Allison Williams riffing on sort of her cachet from Get Out, but not repeating herself. Really loved it.
That's cool. That's interesting that you said that for you, horror is an emotion, particularly nowadays.
Sure.
Could you expand on that? Sounds pretty fascinating.
Well, it's we see it on Twitter pretty much every other week. Is this a horror movie or isn't this a horror movie? Is this science fiction or is this horror? And to me, science fiction is a setting more than a genre. You know.
Yeah.
The Fly is science fiction, but it's a horror movie. Alien is science fiction, but it's a horror movie. And I think that and Star Trek 2 is not a horror movie. You know, the difference is what emotion is that movie trying to get from you? And if it's trying to evoke fear or terror or horror, then it's a horror movie. So it's just about what the movie's goal is in terms of what it wants to do to the receiver, to the viewer, right?
Right.
That's everybody has their own metrics for what is and what isn't a horror movie.
Yeah,
but for
the
me,
Academy calls them thrillers. Like Silence of the Lambs was considered a thriller when it was winning Best Picture.
And then they called something a horror thriller the other day, and I was like, what the hell is that?
What drove me nuts was when people called Get Out a comedy. I was like, that's pretty racist.
Yeah. I mean, that was a more complicated thing. I think that had something to do with the studio trying to jam it into an awards category at the Golden Globes. But you know, that also, let's not take away the fact that between Get Out and Us, he's the only guy to balance genuine comedy and genuine horror like that. Sometimes a horror movie is funny and sometimes a comedy has riffs on some horror themes, but it's doing both and maybe the only guy doing that.
Yeah, and he kind of does it effortlessly too. He just has such a foot in both. I think I heard somewhere that in order for the balance between horror and comedy to work, it's got to be 80% horror, 20% comedy. And his timing in Us, he's I think one of the comedic skills when it comes to writing horror that is funny is knowing kind of where to let the air out, knowing when to kind of have those moments of release, so to speak. And I thought he did that beautifully throughout the course of Us. It just had these little moments where it got so tense, and then he would completely relieve the tension with just like a laugh here and there. Yeah,
and I think all of it's rooted in something he said in his interview in our magazine about believable human behavior.
Right.
Like if you're buying what these people are doing, and you're never asking the audience to sort of suspend too much, you can get away with those moments. You know, he buys this sort of creative capital by getting us to buy in early and getting us to believe in the authenticity of those characters.
Right.
And, that's kind of under-celebrated, I think, when people talk about his stuff.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. You must have spent a bunch of time with him, right? Obviously for the last article, or for the last issue, rather.
It's all email.
Oh, really?
Yeah. No, the guy I spend time with is a gentleman named Ian Cooper, who's I believe his title is creative director at Monkey Paw. He was like Jordan Peele's high school buddy. They work together now.
That's cool.
Ian is my guardian angel in terms of getting not only that interview with Peele and Paul Thomas Anderson in the can for us, but he also got Peele to write a really fascinating one pager about like just details from 3 horror movies. It's one of the most specific articles I've ever read. He zeroes in on a detail on 3 different movies and just why those details sort of make the difference between a good movie and a great movie, kind of in his eyes. And it's a fascinating piece. But Ian over at Monkey Paw also put us in touch with Osgood Perkins, who wrote a one pager about Gretel and Hansel in the new issue.
Oh, cool. So that guy came through in a big way.
Yeah, he's my boy.
That's awesome.
I want everybody to know about Ian Cooper because he's awesome. And he's helping me again in ways I can't tell you yet. But
got it.
Yeah, it's great.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about Horror Noire, which was fantastic, by the way.
Thanks.
It sounds like it was you had a real time of getting that made. And a lot of people would think that would have been made in the wake of Get Out, but it was kind of the opposite, right? You were pitching that way before Get Out ever happened.
No. That's not true. No.
All right, I have the story wrong then.
That's okay. It's a good friend of mine named Ashley Blackwell, who runs a website called Graveyard Shift Sisters, and it's pretty much exclusively about black horror and even more specifically about black horror from a black woman's point of view. Mm-hmm. So she's got a very specific wheelhouse and agenda, although she loves all kinds of films and she goes to see, all kinds of stuff. This is her. She's the expert. In my world, in my little bubble, she was the expert in terms of black horror. Mm-hmm. And I've known her for a few years. And when I walked out of Get Out in, I think, March of 2017, all I could think about was like, I got to talk to Ashley about this. I got to see what Ashley thought about this because she'd been writing about this. She'd been waiting. I felt like, not to presume to speak for her, but it felt like she'd been waiting her whole life for that movie.
Right.
And so I couldn't wait to talk to her about it because I wanted to like experience her joy about it as well. And we got to talking about her whole body of work and what Get Out was going to mean for that body of work. Like what was the next 18 months going to look like? Because Get Out was seismic. It changed so many things in the landscape. I think when it crossed 100 million, the day it crossed 100 million, they announced that J.D. Dillard, who's a black filmmaker, had been signed to a remake of The Fly. And suddenly there was all of these things happening.
Wow.
And so I knew just from a cynical business point of view, Get Out was going to lead to a bunch of stuff.
Right.
But it also seemed like a moment was happening, a moment in film history, and we were there for it. Usually you recognize them later. Mm-hmm. And Ashley and I were sitting there at lunch sort of recognizing it as it was happening. And so my background is in nonfiction television and documentary production, and Ashley's is obviously steeped in black horror. So we partnered on a pitch, and we made what's called a sizzle reel, which started with like the Eddie Murphy stand-up about white people staying in the house and not getting out and stuff, and it was a catchy little sizzle, and we spent all of 2017 pitching it. We pitched it to Netflix, we pitched it to Amazon, Hulu, we pitched it to Monkey Paw, and everybody said no. Nobody wanted to make it for various reasons. Blumhouse said no. Everybody said no. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of disheartening because I knew that somebody was going to make the documentary, and I was like, what are we doing wrong? What didn't we say? What didn't we get across in our pitch? But the day after, so cut to 2018, March, I think, or February, the day after Jordan Peele won the Oscar, Shudder called up and said, let's make it. So that was what moved the needle. Yeah. And which is just such a weird story about how arbitrary it is. Like everybody has different yardsticks for what makes something matter, right? Mm-hmm. And I didn't think the Oscar mattered so much, but for Shudder, it was everything. He won the Oscar. Let's do it. And we had pitched a 4-part series, but Shudder wanted a one-off. They wanted a feature.
Oh wow! It was supposed to be a 4-parter. Mm-hmm. Whoa!
Yeah, that's why we kind of jam right past the Tuskegee experiment. Why we fly through the '90s a little bit. There's a longer story in there, and that's why when I wrote the final title, I called it "A History of Black Horror" instead of "The History of Black Horror," because to me it was a conversation starter, and it's not the final word. And we continue today, which is almost 3 months later, to be just amazed by the reaction. I knew it was going to connect with people. I knew it was a good story, and I knew it wasn't my story to tell. So we assembled a table. I described it as I set a dinner party, and I invited all the right people to the dinner table, and they all told the story. If you've seen the doc, they tell it. Yep. They tell it to each other, which is kind of interesting. And I had no idea it was going to connect the way it did, the level it did, and it got Shudder. Talked about it in NPR, at Forbes, and LA Times, and people
awesome.
they Shudder timed it for Black History Month, which is fine, but then like 3 weeks into March, Us opened, and then we got like this weird second life from it, and it's still kicking, and it's one of the few things I think that Shudder has made available for sale on iTunes.
Oh yeah, I noticed that.
So I think it's much better bargain to subscribe to Shudder, but if you're not going to do that, it's on iTunes for $10.
Nice.
Which is cool.
I thought one of my favorite scenes was just parts of it was seeing Kevin Forey and Keith David in a movie theater talking and watching together. I thought that whole device of putting people in a movie theater and just having them talking back and forth was pretty inventive and pretty cool. How did that come about as a storytelling vehicle?
That was in like one of the first drafts of the pitch. It was because it was every time we talked to somebody, we talked to somebody about horror, or an African American about horror. It was about somewhere in their reason for loving Black horror. It was about seeing themselves on screen, looking at the screen to find themselves. And so we took it literally, and we said, well, let's put them in a theater. Let's show them looking at the screen, looking at themselves, looking for themselves, and then it just became a device, like a metaphor that we made literal, and then it ended up being a great way to sort of get them to talk to each other, because we put like a highlight reel up on the screen.
Right.
And we played it in a loop. So what they're watching is like a 90-second clip of Night of the Living Dead, a 60-second clip of Dawn of the Dead, a bit of Abbey, a bit of Sugar Hill, and they would see a certain scene. Sometimes they were in the scene, right? Like Ken Forey seeing himself in Dawn of the Dead. But sometimes they would just see a movie that they hadn't saw since they were 12. Yeah. And they would light up and they would start talking about it and they would share stories. And that would have gotten us one level of engagement, a very anecdotal, autobiographical thing. But thank God we had academics, but in terms of the filmmakers and the actors, thank God for Ernest Dickerson. Thank God for Rachel True. And then Ken and Keith, they all knew so much more about the history of Black horror, of cinema, than I anticipated, than I expected, or even deserved. Like that's
super cool.
It was like, we rolled the dice somewhat. We didn't pre-interview anybody really.
Yeah.
Sometimes those pairings were down to logistics and availability. Who was around to talk with who? We didn't know if they hated each other. It could have gone another way.
Yeah.
So it was really fortunate that it worked out the way it did.
That's great.
Yeah.
You just put them in a room together. You rolled a couple clips, and then you just let these things unfold. Yeah, it had a very natural quality to it.
Yeah.
It didn't feel overly kind of. Nobody sounded like they were reading from a teleprompter. It was very conversational, but still everybody clearly knew their film history. I mean, it was a very cool balance in that regard.
Yeah, and Ashley was there the whole time to sort of give them talking points if they were going somewhere else. Because, they just get to talking.
Yeah.
Ken and Keith start talking, and suddenly we're somewhere else. We're not even talking about movies
I could have watched
anymore.
a whole movie of just the two of them talking. They should have a podcast.
Yeah, they should.
That would be cool.
Hey, never say never.
Yeah.
And then Xavier Bergen, who's our director, was making sure that he captured it all in the with the 3-camera setup that we had in the theater. So it was it was faster than we would have liked, because when they said they wanted it in 4 months.
Whoa.
There's a longer version that I would have liked to have had the time to deliver.
Right.
But maybe it would have felt like homework if it was a 4-part series. Maybe it would have felt a little more daunting of a thing, as opposed to this 82 thing that people just come out of the viewing experience buzzing about.
Yeah. It was a pretty easy watch. It just kind of, you breezed right through it, but it was still powerful. Yeah. What were some of the most painful things to cut? Was there anything that you really wanted to be in there?
I think I would have liked to have spent more time on the 90s.
Okay.
And it wasn't that we were cut the things. It was that we didn't have material to really flesh it out the way I would have liked. So, for example, Death by Temptation, the logistics just didn't work out, and we couldn't get that director to come to sit with us and talk. So that was a drag. Eve's Bayou, we did not have the time and budget to film in New York, so we missed out on Casey Lemons. That kind of sucked. It wasn't that we had to cut out material so much as that the accelerated schedule meant that we didn't have time to get everything.
Yeah.
So
I gotcha.
Yeah.
So obviously horror as a category goes up during times of social unrest. What are some of the, obviously thematically, there's a lot of things that are explored in Us. There's a lot of things that are explored in Get Out and some more horror movies. What are some of the kind of potential topics that you think horror movies are going to start to cover, considering where we are socially in America?
I don't know. I think people are starting to worry about sustainability. and people are starting to worry about, what kind of world will their kids live in. So I think there's a bleak forecast kind of thing happening right now, and I'm not sure how that'll shake out. I don't know if we're going to get a bunch of Bronx Warriors movies out of it.
Right.
I mean, like, knock on wood, that would be rad.
That would be cool.
But I do think that Trump broke us a little bit. I think that there's a schism that nobody can ignore now. And everybody has to have an opinion. Everybody has to take a side.
Right.
And that makes things very binary.
Yeah.
And I think that when things are binary, we're not getting anywhere.
Yeah.
That's about all. Intellectually, that's about all I'm prepared to weigh in on.
Yeah. No, I think that's the most terrifying thing about these times is that just the internal division that's happening. I feel like we've never been more divided. And I think it's because of that binary sensibility. Yeah. And I think somebody who taps into that as a horror concept, who does it right, that could be huge. Just the internal division that is causing us as a nation to just be distracted by political correctness and all this just nonsense. When there's like bigger threats, arguably, outside of the United States. Sure. Yeah. I think that's the most terrifying thing about what's happening.
And just in terms of like American horror, the idea that we're kind of looking at what sort of Britain looked at after World War II is where we're like maybe dwindling in terms of like our place on the global stage. And I don't know how that'll shake out exactly either, but
yeah, I don't know.
I don't know if we'll be worried about horror movies in 10 years. Like, as you say, we might have bigger fish to fry.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, one of the things I love about the magazine is that it has a foot in the spirit of the original in a big way, but it doesn't go out of its way to be tongue-in-cheek. And it is – a lot of the articles are very sophisticated. I mean, it has a level of depth to it that the original ones sort of did, but it feels like it's a whole new level. It's not like overly intellectual or something, but I mean it's the intelligence of the articles is great, and it has a lot of depth to it, but it still does feel like Fangoria.
Sure.
So I'm wondering how that all came together. Okay. Structurally.
To me, the era that I grew up in was the early 80s of Fango. And so the early 80s of Fango, it was not particularly dyed-in-the-wool horror fans writing about it.
Right.
They were writers. They were talented journalists, and they had a gig writing about horror movies.
But it was a gig.
And I liked that about it. I liked that these people weren't like incestuous horror fans. I liked that it was just sort of there were voices and there was perspective and there was a little bit of a reverence. Like the early Fangos to me are closer to something like National Lampoon.
Yeah, totally.
Than say even a Fango from 1994, right? And the magazine obviously evolved because fandom evolved and the culture evolved. And then once you have the internet, suddenly you don't need a magazine for news anymore. And it kind of, I think the magazine struggled with how to maintain those eyeballs.
Right.
And there was a lot of internal strife that under no fault of the writers or editors of the magazine. And I've gotten to know those people. I've brought some of them back into the fold. Our 40th anniversary issue is going to have writers from as much of the spectrum of the 40 years as I can.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Yeah. And but all of their struggles aside, in 2018, what's a Fangoria supposed to look like? What does it need to look like when you've got Rue Morgue doing such a great job?
Right.
When you've got Diabolique doing a great job and Horror Hound doing an awesome job. What you don't want to just be another one, because these guys had kind of picked up the mantle from where Fango had left. So we had to sort of justify our space, I think.
Yeah.
And the way to do that was to kind of come at it from a little bit of a different angle. And that's sort of what I pitched to Dallas when he talked to me about the gig. He wanted he kept saying the Vanity Fair of horror.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I'm like, sure. But at the same time, I think it needs to look like a magazine from 1983 from across the room.
Right.
And I'm sitting there at a printer in Dallas, Texas, showing him a Fango 32 going, it has to look like this from across the room. But then when you get closer, and so we worked on the level of gloss on the cover to try to replicate the way that Fango caught my eye on a newsstand 35 years ago, right? So that was part of it. And the other thing was I did feel like it needed to sort of have a weird balance of legacy and evolution. So when you open it up, you said something about how it feels like retro, but not. Like it's very specifically. You start at the cover and you travel through the table of contents. You travel through that original Monster Invasion logo, and then Tony and Mike's columns. Those are purposefully kind of laid out in a vintage style.
Yeah.
And the letters column and whatnot. And then as you get in, it gets a little more modern.
Right.
And then sort of takes you back out through the same door, like on the back page with the classifieds and stuff. So that was all by design. And I like that. And I don't know, maybe after the 4th issue, maybe after a year, we won't do that anymore. We'll move into a different direction. But I wanted people to feel like it was their Fango still, out of the gate at least, right? And I think as you know, that all that unrest that we talked about, I think that's a big part of why Fango was only gone for a year and a half.
Was it only a year and a half?
Yeah.
I don't know. I felt like 3 years. Yeah, I was one of those people who was burned. I got a subscription. I got 2 that year, and one was had It Follows on the cover.
Yep.
And that was the only one I got that year. That and like something else had like Vampira on the cover.
Elvira.
Yes, it was. I think it was
Elvira was the last printed issue. There's a couple of digital ones after that. The last 2 never were released, but they were curated, they were written, they were edited, they were numbered. And so if you look at the film strip sidebar of a new Fango, you'll see we do have legacy numbering in there.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
I kept it. I didn't hear any of that for the first issue. Everybody was just Instagramming pictures of the cover.
There's a lot of that. A lot of like unboxing.
Yeah, I'm like, we put a lot of work inside the damn thing. Maybe what'd you think of this article?
Well, they last a long time. They easily can last a quarter.
Hey, almost like
so
we planned
good.
It that way.
It feels it does feel very much like a book.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, and it's fun to kind of take your time with it.
Yeah. And the whole goal was like a magazine that felt like it had grown up with me, right?
That's interesting.
So I read Fango in 83, 84, 85, and I read one version of it, and I was like, how do I create that feeling in myself now in 2018, 2019?
Right.
And it was that's what we're going for. I don't know if I've gotten there yet, but I think that's sort of the dream.
Yeah. No, it does feel like it has grown up with me anyway, because I mean, I do have a foot in the old kind of throwback 80s, 90s horror movies and the vibe of Fangoria.
Yeah.
And the fun of, I had a stack of Fangorias right next to Playboys that I had to hide from my parents. But yeah, they would take them away from me. So it still kind of has that devilish, I shouldn't be reading this feel to it. It still kind of has that feel. Yeah. But the last few questions.
Sure.
So one thing that you touched on in Fangoria was the fact that for horror to really feel like horror, it kind of has to have that element of danger, and it kind of has to you need to kind of at some point think to yourself, did I make the wrong decision starting to watch this movie? I haven't felt that way in a really long time. Has anything made you feel that way, that kind of level of danger that you would feel either as a child or teenager starting to watch a horror movie that might be a little too intense for you? Has anything touched that feeling lately?
Once in a while, I'll find an old movie from the 70s or 80s that does give me that feeling. But if you're talking about new releases, it's
either or.
It's harder to pinpoint one. I do feel like one of the movies that I walked out and just felt unsafe after was Funny Games.
Ooh, I haven't seen that one.
It's
the old one or the new one?
Well, I watched the English language one, but even that one's 12 years old now. So
yeah, well, there was one with Michael Pitt that I think came out recently.
Yeah,
it's not that one.
Haneke made basically a shot-for-shot remake of his original language film with Michael Pitt, Naomi Watts, and Tim Roth, and it is mortifying. As a grown-up who is responsible for other people in my life now, and who has a home that he needs to quote unquote protect, that movie messed me up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Noted. Yeah.
But for horror movies today, I guess I kind of, and I sound like a bad horror fan, but when they're trying to be extreme, and when they're trying to be in your face about how messed up they are, it always feels very try hard.
Very much.
You have to earn it. And earning it's getting harder, obviously.
Yeah.
Just because audiences are getting more sophisticated. Right.
Well, the other day I rewatched Last House on the Left, and that I was surprised at how difficult it was for me to get through. It was real, and it's so stripped down, and it's so low budget.
Yeah.
And it touched that feeling for me, that real feeling of just palpable danger and wrongness in watching something. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I forgot how powerful that movie was.
Yeah, and I think a lot of horror has sort of drifted into this carnival space.
Right.
Where, and I'm a horror fan. I go to conventions. I've been going to conventions for 15, 20 years and you don't go to feel unsafe. You don't go to feel like messed with. Like it's just, it's fun because at some point it's turned into mac and cheese for us and it's comfort food and we want to be around these things that we love, right? And with other people who love them too. And that's a huge part of the community, but I just don't feel like for horror to grow and evolve, it can't really grow and evolve from that space, I don't think, in any kind of meaningful way.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think I read somewhere that horror fans tend to have the highest IQs out of all genre people because there's some sort of connection between wanting to go to very dark places and the thrill that you get out of doing that. And it also apparently apparently horror fans are some of the nicest people too. Like I was talking to Mick Garris and he said that he let like Tobe Hooper, Wes Craven, John Carpenter are some of the sweetest people he's ever met. Interesting. And apparently horror, because people if they don't have any real natural darkness in them, they'll be drawn to dark arts because it's such a thrill to have to have an experience that's so far removed with how you normally feel.
Right. Well, what's interesting to me is that all those people that you named didn't set out to be horror filmmakers.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Wes Craven was an academic and John Carpenter wanted to make Westerns and George Romero wanted to make Tarzan movies and they fell into horror and they eventually embraced it, but their brand of horror was more groundbreaking because they weren't just ingesting one thing compulsively. Right. I think they had a more well-rounded diet, let's say. Yeah. In terms of their film education. Mm-hmm. And so when I see a horror film by somebody who's only watched horror films, there's something missing. Yeah. So that's why,
I mean, my litmus test is always if you can remove the horror element, do the characters work? Does the movie work? Is it still good? Like Dusk Till Dawn's a perfect example. Sure. They didn't need the vampires. Sure. It's just a nice little addition. Yeah.
And that's why Peele and Ari Aster are so exciting to me because they're doing new things in the space. And Hereditary, I didn't walk out of Hereditary being freaked out, but I did have nightmares that night.
Did you?
Yeah. It was an unsettling movie. And a lot of it was just weird subliminal sound work that he was doing. Yeah. Just sort of, you left feeling uneasy.
Gaspar Noé kind of techniques.
Yeah. Yeah. Tones and drones and whatnot.
Uh-huh. There was definitely a lot of, there were tones that just didn't feel right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's a master. I'm really excited at what he's going to do next.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty awesome. You're the editor-in-chief of Fangoria. You guys are doing movies now. You just did Horror Noire. Pretty much living the dream for a horror fan. Sure. What advice do you have for people who want to do similar things as you're doing, who want to get into the horror business, so to speak?
Gosh, I think what this space needs and what this space is hungry for is new points of view. Mm-hmm. So have something to say. Don't give me the same, think piece that I'm going to find 15 different places on the internet. Right. I think that it's great that horror is so big right now, but that means that there's so many more people talking about it, and it's turning into white noise. Right. And I think that's why you'll see on our bylines, we tend to go outside the lines a little bit, trying to find people who have something new or different to say, different points of view about horror. Right. And if you don't know what that is yet, spend some time figuring it out, I think. Mm-hmm. Because I'm always looking for somebody who's got a new point of view that can articulate that point of view in an entertaining way. I don't want to read another college paper. I don't want to read something that you did not leave your bedroom to source or research. Or if you're saying doing what I do, because I think what I do is considered nonfiction storytelling, right? That's the big bubble. Whether it's the magazine, whether it's blog stuff, whether it's the documentary, I'm talking about horror, and the secret sauce is that you've got to know your stuff and you've got to do the work. Mm-hmm. There's so many pieces I turn down because it's just somebody typing their thoughts, right? And we're not everybody's that special. I don't mean to sound harsh, but you gotta get in there and mix it up with the world.
Gotcha. Great. Last question, and this is just like a rapid fire, this or that. American Werewolf or Howling?
American Werewolf.
Henenlotter or Yuzna?
Henenlotter.
Fulci, Bava or Argento?
Argento.
Misfits or Metallica? Or Iron Maiden? Or none? Or Slayer?
Sabbath.
Fright Night or Lost Boys?
Fright Night.
Nice. Awesome. Phil, this was a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
All right, big thank you to Phil Nobile Jr. for taking the time. If you enjoy horror-related podcasts, be sure to check out everything that's going on at the Fangoria Podcast Network. They are putting out all sorts of great stuff. My personal favorites are Nightmare University with Rebecca McKendry and Postmortem with Mick Garris, which I've been listening to for a long time, and most recently, Casualty Friday with Kane Hodder, Tiffany Shepis, and Felissa Rose. That show is a lot of fun. Anyway, guys, thank you again for listening to the Nick Taylor Horror Show. If you enjoyed this episode, it'd mean the world to me if you shared it with your friends and family on social media. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And if you haven't already, definitely do yourself a favor and head on over to fangoria.com and get yourself a subscription. You will not be disappointed. Thanks again, guys.